probably best to start with the more somber, serious focus right now, the situation in the Middle East, in Israel. And I know that you actually have staff in Israel. So, first and foremost, are they all safe and well accounted for? And if you like, you could talk maybe a bit about the any potential implications of the current conflict for TMX. I know Israel is a big part of your growth strategy.
It is. And actually, thank you for opening for that, because I think given everything that's going on in the world, it's important to take a moment from a TMX standpoint just to resonate the fact that we're appalled at what's happened. We're appalled, and the innocent loss of life is deplorable. Our mission here is to ensure the safety and security of our own people and the staff and the families and the friends of the staff and our organization as well. So as you said, we actually do have operations on the ground in Israel. We're actually one of the largest markets in the world for Israel companies to come and list and raise capital in other marketplaces. We've got over 17 companies that have raised capital here. So, right now our thoughts, our prayers are, they're with our clients, they're with our employees and with the family and friends of those employees. And we've made sure we're doing everything we can for our folks that are in the region. So thank you for opening with that and giving us the opportunity to kind of express our concern, but our focus on the well-being of our team.
Absolutely. And then on a speedy resolution to any violence, of course, on all sides. On the notion of TMX as a global business, given that it's certainly reputedly focused on Canada, but as I had the pleasure of learning recently, is increasingly international. In fact, it's not going to be too long where more of your revenue is going to be coming from outside the country than inside the country. So how does that play into the global capital markets picture? TMX, Canadian company, Canada's largest stock exchange operator, and yet, it's increasingly a non-Canadian business.
Well, I'm going to get increasingly non-Canadian in my comment here.
Right.
Because as Canadians, we are very good at being reserved and apologetic. And when it comes to the success of the Canadian capital markets, we need to stop doing that, because we actually are one of the best capital markets in the world. We are the only capital market in the world that has successfully created a public ecosystem where small companies can raise junior capital, can grow over their life cycle, and grow into large blue chip companies that worldwide investors want to invest in. No one else in the world has been able to replicate that structure that the Canadian ecosystem has created. And that's what makes it really attractive to be able to take the Canada market to the world. So by TMX, the company, taking the aspiration of ensuring that we are a more global than regional business, it gets wound into our DNA to ensure that our data reaches investors all over the world, that investors even time zones away can connect to the Canadian markets to get access to those Canadian assets. And so we measure ourselves of how much does our international revenue grow as a mix. We want it to be more than half, so that while our home address is Canada, our business is global. And by doing that, we can help bring more global attention to the great Canadian stories that are here on our home front. And at the same time, showing the story of what a great ecosystem we have, we actually bring these international companies to list in Canada. A lot of people wouldn't know that we're actually one of the largest listers of international companies globally, because we have this unique ecosystem where we can help small companies raise capital. I think we have over 250 companies from around the world that come to list here, including those 17 I talked about from Israel.
That's right. So what is it about other markets, or you can answer this in the reverse, of course, what is it about Canada that makes it possible for this ecosystem to exist and to thrive here, whereas it's certainly been tried and attempted to be replicated elsewhere and just not been successful?
What makes it work is you have to have the whole ecosystem works together. So I'm going to start with the end of that. There are a number of countries that have tried to replicate what we've created in our TSX Venture Exchange rulebook. Venture Exchange is the small cap market for Canada. Over 1,900 companies listed. A lot of these would be $10 and $20 million companies. Anywhere else in the world, these are private companies that regular everyday retail shareholders don't get to invest in. But over the years, through the history of Canadian resource development, that's how the ecosystem got created to help finance junior startup companies. And then over time, we continued collectively with the ecosystem to modify so that technology companies could raise money this way, life sciences could raise money this way, and even more importantly today, technology companies that support energy markets, energy transition, clean tech, clean energy can raise money this way. So it takes, I like to say it takes a village to raise a child, but in this case, it actually takes the whole ecosystem. You need to have people that can finance these kind of companies. You need to have regulations that make sense, that are proportionate to small companies. You need to have a disclosure structure where you can find out information about these types of companies. So you need everything working together to support this junior ecosystem. And when it works really well, and this is the, kind of the gold star, we can help those companies grow through their life cycle. You don't just list them and forget them.
Right.
You mentor them. You help them with disclosure. You help them with what it means to be a good public company. And over time, help them with raising their next rounds of capital so they eventually grow to the size where they can graduate, be a TSX company. We've been doing this for over 20 years. We have graduated over 750 companies that started as these micro-cap Canadian success stories, raised money over their life cycle, and graduated to being TSX companies.
How do you do that, though, in the modern context when it comes to, compliance and disclosure, for example? That is such a rapidly evolving issue for public companies, particularly on the disclosure front, talking about shifting from Canada's, very oil and gas, base metals, which is still very much, the plurality, if not the majority of our capital markets. That there's the shift to, as you noted, renewables and an energy transition that is underway. How do you help facilitate that as a capital markets operator, while at the same time, ensuring that things like disclosure rules, which are, in flux as we speak, are not becoming an additional burden while still doing what they're intended to do?
Yeah, and thank you for putting it in that way, because our purpose as an organization, and we rewrote this in the last couple of years, is to make markets better and empower bold ideas. So we do see the role of the TMX as not just to operate the market, but it is actually to advocate for smart regulation, for modernization, so that companies can successfully raise money and sustainably grow in terms of empowering their bold ideas. So we actually think it's our role to stand up and talk about what smart regulation looks like. When we talk about disclosure standards that are coming down the pipeline, like new disclosure around environmental standards, international standards around that, what we need to do around diversity, we're trying to step in to understand both what the investor needs and what the capacities are for companies to actually report, and help educate people that the capacity for Suncor is going to be very different than the capacity for a $10 million startup with a board of 3. And one of the things that's made our market successful is this concept of proportionate regulation. The rule book for a junior company is different than the rule book for a senior company. The expectations around disclosure are different. And we want to make sure that as new things come down the pipeline, we look at it in that same lens. Now, simply, I also, when I talk to regulators and government agents as well, I sometimes ask for, let's have the discotheque rule with this, which is if you want to let someone else into the disco, let's get something off the table first. And we've got to keep relooking the disclosure rules that we've created, because some of these rules go back to before we had the internet.
Right.
And so there are things in there that we could make more efficient for companies, therefore giving them the capacity to do things that the modern investors are looking for, like better environmental disclosure.
So what do we get out of the disco then in order to fit in that environmental disclosure skaters?
There's a lot of things that are technical in terms of disclosure and how you can do it online instead of in print. No offense to print publications.
Still capital positive in that paper. So,
but even I'll give you a very simple thing. We recommended this into the modernization task force in Ontario. A lot of small companies, their stories don't change every quarter. Why are we asking them to report quarterly? Why don't we give them the option to report semi-annually like European companies do? Let those management teams spend more time focusing on building their business, talking to their clients, hiring, expanding, and less time on disclosure that, frankly, for them is not going to change quarter to quarter. So that's one we're going to keep advocating for. Haven't got the traction on it yet, but sometimes you have to keep pushing these things and build a coalition around them before you can make change.
So one of the things that, this whole forum is focused on is that economy of the future. And, certainly we've touched on this a little bit, that notion of TMX becoming a more global company. And what we're seeing in capital markets is effectively globalization taking root in the way shares or are bought and sold of any company anywhere, startups like Blue Ocean Technologies that are making it possible to, buy and share stocks in any time zone at any time. Are we reaching a point where we're going to see almost an Uberization of stock exchanges where, you can buy a stock regardless of where it's domiciled at any time, anywhere? And, is that eventually going to lead to a consolidation of the industry that you're a part of?
So yes and no. In all of that, transparency still matters.
Right.
Regulation still matters. Investor protection still matters. We could today change our technology and make all the TSX stocks available to trade 24 hours a day. I can guarantee you, if you or I went to trade one of those companies at 4 o'clock in the morning, we're probably going to get screwed.
Why is that?
Because the liquidity is not there in the middle of the night to ensure that the investors get good execution. So the reason we have barriers around the marketplace isn't because it's a technology limitation. It's because we're trying to make sure collectively, ourselves, regulators, the intermediaries, that the market has integrity, that transmission of company information is disclosed simultaneously, that everyone gets the same opportunity to trade on it. And so those are the kind of things we need to think about as we modernize, as we change the technology base, is how do we ensure that we still get good disclosure, we still have transparency, and we still have investor protection? Because at the end of the day, what are the capital markets here for? We always talk to them about the ability to trade on them, but it's actually about the ability to raise money. And that's the piece we want to never lose sight of. The capital markets are to help companies raise money. The public market, even though that private markets have actually been growing faster the last number of years, the public market is still larger by multiples. It is faster growing in terms of actual dollars raised. The companies on them are the fastest growing companies in the market. They hire more people. They create more IP. And when you think about a market like Canada, that is, number 10 and competes against behemoths around the world, when those companies get financed in Canada, they're more likely to stay Canadian. They're more likely to have jobs that stay in Canada. They're more likely to have IP that remains in Canada. So ensuring that that market remains liquid and transparent and accessible is really key. So we always want to look at those modernization pieces with the lens of how do they help the underlying core of what we're trying to do, which is help companies raise money, expand, and grow and prosper.
So the notion of raising money being the core value that capital markets provide, something that's already in place in the United States, and clock's ticking pretty fast on it taking effect in Canada, is the buyback tax. And we've already seen just basic math showing that there was a rush to get buybacks done in the U.S. before they ended up having to pay the tax. Do you anticipate a slowdown in raising money using that method once the tax takes effect?
The risk on the buyback tax, and we've tried to illustrate this to policymakers, is you've actually got a tax that interferes in the normal course of a business being able to manage its balance sheet effectively and efficiently. And so taxing buybacks of stock when you don't actually give the tax relief when companies raise money, it's inconsistent. It's actually a triple tax because you've already taxed those companies' earnings twice already, either on their actual corporate earnings or on distributions as the capital gains to the actual end holders. So putting in a friction point for companies to return money to shareholders is completely illogical. If a company has excess capital, give it back to the shareholders. The shareholders then can deploy that into other companies that have growth aspirations. So candidly, it's a bad tax. It's a bad policy. It's politically motivated, and it has unintended consequences that weren't thought through. If we had one concern overall beyond that policy change, it's a pattern. It's a pattern of governments not understanding capital markets, not understanding what it takes for companies to raise money, and making changes without actually consulting the folks that actually operate the markets to understand what are the impacts that this going to have. This wasn't the only one.
Sure.
Dividend taxes, bank taxes, all of these things have negative impacts on the abilities for companies to actually get the capital they need to grow and to prosper. And so that's actually one of the reasons that we thought from a TMX standpoint, we had to start stepping more forward and talking on behalf of the, essentially 3,600 issuers that we represent on our marketplaces. There's no trade association for public companies. And there's a general view that public companies are all large and well capitalized and have benefits and don't need help. And what we're trying to help show is actually the bulk of the Canadian public companies are small and medium enterprises They are the mom and pop shops in your neighborhoods as well. And we don't want to see them disadvantaged by government policy that doesn't actually understand what it takes for companies to grow.
What is the basis for that misunderstanding? Because it's permeated for years, if not decades, of not just Canadian society, but I think I'm on solid ground to say that that's almost a universal assumption, is that if you're a publicly traded company, you are all the things that you just described, whether that's true or not.
And maybe it is because in other parts of the world, that is the case. And the Canadian market is unique in how many small public companies we have. So it's the impetus is on us to tell their stories. We have so many stories that we can tell about great companies that started as these small cap companies. And I'll give you one right off the top. Converge Technology Solutions. This is a great company that provides cloud hosting and technology, listed on the Venture Exchange in 2016, has so far raised almost $800 million in capital, graduated to TSX in 2020, used the capital they raised to acquire other businesses and expand and grow. 100% Canadian listed, Canadian employee base, great success story. So we need to do a better job collectively of telling the stories of these Canadian successes and these companies that grow up here. And too much media attention is on these big companies so that people think that the experience of Royal Bank is typical of a small public company.
Right. So on the notion of, unique aspects of the Canadian market, one thing that I think, many who are coming to visit from outside of Canada may be surprised to learn is just the sheer lack of investment from large Canadian pension funds, some of which are the largest in the world, in Canadian public equities. You look at the big pension funds in the US, in Asia Pacific region, in Europe, and they have at least 20, 30, 40% of their portfolios in their own home countries. And as I'm sure you and many of the folks in our audience know, there used to be a law that said that Canadian pension funds had to invest, I think it was up to at least 70% of their assets in Canadian markets. And that is no longer the case. And I know Peter Letgo, who's now, stepping into an advisory role at Letgo Perso, one thing he's going to be pounding the table on, even louder than he has in the past, and he's not here, so I'll pound a little bit for him, is that Canadian pension funds should be investing more in our public markets. Is that something, if it were to gain political traction, would it achieve what he says it would achieve, which is, increased R&D, more initial public offerings, perhaps even on par proportionately with what we see in the United States?
I think it can only help. And so we're looking to get more vocal on this issue as well. And I think it's early stage, and I'm hearing more building of a coalition of voices that want to talk to this particular issue. I understand how this is happening. We probably had it wrong before with the 70% rule, and we've probably got it wrong now. Because right now, most of our pension funds, particularly the large super public ones, just have a return mandate. Right. And the Canadian economy is 3% of the global economy. So where are they going to look to diversify? And I think the estimate is about 4% of their assets are Canadian equities.
That's right.
We are not the only country in the world that's got this challenge, though. And I've had the same chat with the head of the LSE. And in the UK market, they are looking at potential pension legal reform that would incent pensions in the UK to invest in UK businesses. That's absolutely something that Canada can look at. And there's lots of different ways we can. We can either look at it towards the regulation of pensions and where they put their assets, or we can look at how do we actually incent and de-risk investment in Canada. So a lot of the other policy pieces we put forward, we make recommendations around things like R&D tax credit reform, flow through shares, are all designed to de-risk investing in Canadian companies. And if we can help change that balance of risk and return, we can create the incentive for these funds to invest in Canada as well. So I do believe this is an opportunity for both awareness and also some potentially push and pull. Both the demand side and the supply side of actually getting Canadian pension funds to look more at Canadian businesses. The more we can help companies scale up, the more companies that are going to be big enough to sit in some of these very large portfolios as well.
Right. Yeah. And then, of course, you have that positive feedback loop created for the Canadian economy. Though more globally, I want to bring you back to that question about consolidation in the capital markets, right? You had that chat with the LSE. It was, not too long ago that the LSE was knocking on TMX's door, looking to create a bit of a marriage there. So at what point does the increasing globalization of capital markets necessitate there being a more sort of conglomeration of individual capital market operations?
I didn't intentionally avoid that question earlier.
No, I know. I tend to ask 5 or 6 questions at once and hoping that 3 or 4 of them.
Thanks for bringing me back to it. I don't think the rationale for those kind of large global exchange mergers over borders actually exists in the same degree it even did 10 years ago.
Oh,
What we discovered 10 years ago, going through those proposals, and every major market did, is that capital markets, even though they become more global, are so critical to a national economy. So the national interest, the regulatory interest, the political interest, ensuring that they are supporting local economy is so important that it's very hard to get over the political test of having one country's exchange own another's. That being said, as we talk about technology opening borders up, the need to create these global constructs isn't the same anymore. So, for example, we now operate our derivatives market 21 hours a day.
right.
So I can already support Australian investors that want to buy Canadian futures directly and clear seamlessly through intermediaries. We don't need to put the exchanges together to do that. We already support the North American economy in a way that any company that either lists or in Canada or the US clears seamlessly across the border and the investors don't notice. And we do that through participation in technology. So I do believe that technology is an enabler that makes it easy for even a regional market like Canada to access the world and the world to access Canada. And we don't need to pursue those kind of mergers or transactions or joint ventures in the future.
It's interesting. I'll make this my last question. I would be mindful of our audience's time and the fact that they're probably getting a bit hungry. Is when we talk about the energy transition, and we've addressed this in a couple of different ways already, but just to sort of wrap things up, do capital markets have an active role to play in terms of facilitating that transition? Does TMX have a capacity to encourage issuers to move to, the low carbon economy, given that such a large proportion, especially in this market, is oil, is, I guess you'd call them the legacy economies, maybe the term to use, or is it more just, you're more of a passive observer in that transition and facilitating it by allowing the market forces to do what they do?
We actually have to help the market forces do what they do.
Right.
I'm so glad you asked this particular question to finish on, because we raised this year on our marketplaces in the energy sector less than 400 million in new capital.
Right. Now, when you say the energy sector, though, you're talking about oil and gas?
Oil and gas,
right,
in general. And some of that are and companies that are actually high standard, very clean companies. We used to raise in just that segment alone $5 billion a year. And in the broader energy sector, when you think about clean tech and the facilitation and infrastructure and pipeline, we had years where we did as much as $20 billion of financing.
Wow.
Canada has been, in the past, a global leader in financing the energy sector. For energy transition to be successful, it has to be integrated with the energy sector in general, because it's the same companies that need to raise capital to do carbon capture and storage or to install green energy development. These are the same ones that actually have legacy operations. So there's no dividing line between them. And the challenge that companies have now, and the challenge that the markets have now, is there is a confidence gap in the ability to finance investment, both in the clean side and in the traditional side of the energy mix. Bill C-69 that came into Canada a number of years ago in terms of the Environmental Assessment Act, how many projects have actually been approved, national projects, since that came in? None.
Yeah.
Because there isn't confidence to invest behind large-scale, multi-billion-dollar projects if you don't have a sense of, can I get it permitted? Can I actually get it executed? What's the time frame to do it? What's the cost going to be on the emissions side for the things that come out of it? How do I capture them?
So then what is the role for TMX and other market operators to play to try and, I guess the argument you're making is to convince investors that...
Two roles.
Yeah.
We've got to help actually on the policy side to make sure there's a framework that supports public companies raising money in this sector. We have to tell the company stories. And we have to make sure as a public market that environmental reporting gets done and gets done better so that these large companies can actually show that they're actually some of the best operators in the world. We already know it's the case, but we actually have to help them show that to the global community.
It's a great note to end on. John, thanks for subjecting yourself to me and to the rest of us. And it's been a pleasure chatting with you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.